The Unseen Scars of Haden. Chapter 1: A Chill in the Air. The first thing I noticed about Haden was the silence. Not the peaceful quiet of a lazy Sunday morning, but a hushed, almost reverent stillness that seemed to hang over the town like a shroud. It was the kind of silence that wasn't just heard, but felt, a tangible presence that filled the streets and alleys with unspoken words and secrets. I had left the cacophony of New York, seeking solace in what I thought was a tranquil, small town. I was a private detective tired of the relentless rhythm of the city, yearning for a change of pace. But Haden, nestled in the heart of New England, was not the haven I had imagined. The town itself was picturesque, almost deceptively so. Quaint cobblestone streets lined with old brick buildings gave it a charming, almost timeless feel. The central town square was dominated by an old clock tower, its chimes marking the passing hours with a sonorous tone that echoed through the streets. But beneath this idyllic facade lurked an undercurrent of something darker, something I would soon find myself inextricably drawn into. I rented a modest office near the town square, a small, unassuming space above a local bakery. The sweet scent of freshly baked bread wafted up each morning, a comforting, if fleeting, respite from the complexities of my day-to-day work. My practice as a private detective had been a deliberate choice, a profession that allowed me to delve into the mysteries of human behavior while maintaining a semblance of distance. I preferred the shadows, the edges of society where secrets lived and breathed. In those first weeks, my cases were mundane, forgettable. Haden seemed sleepy, almost lethargic in its everyday routines. The townspeople were cordial, yet there was a reservation in their greetings, a guardedness in their eyes that suggested they were accustomed to keeping outsiders at arm's length. I often found myself wandering the streets after hours, the cool New England air biting at my cheeks, observing the town and its inhabitants. There was a rhythm to Haden, a cadence that spoke of old traditions and long-held beliefs. That all changed one brisk autumn morning when Mrs. Eleanor Whitaker walked into my office. Her appearance was unremarkable, yet there was an undeniable aura of distress about her. She was the epitome of a small-town matron, her clothes neat but modest, her hair pulled back in a tight bun. Yet her hands, clasped tightly around her purse, betrayed a nervous energy, and her eyes, darting around the room, spoke of fear. "Mr. Thompson," she began, her voice barely more than a whisper, "I need your help." It was in that moment, with those simple words, that the true nature of Haden began to unfold before me. What I had perceived as a quiet, unassuming town was in fact a tapestry of secrets and lies, and I was about to pull on the thread that would unravel it all. As Mrs. Whitaker settled uneasily into the chair across from my desk, I couldn't help but notice the way her eyes flickered towards the window, as if expecting to see someone peering in. It was a paranoia that seemed out of place in someone of her demeanor. "I'm not sure where to begin," she confessed, her voice tinged with a weariness that seemed to go beyond mere physical exhaustion. "It's about my husband, George. He's been acting so strangely these past few weeks." I leaned back in my chair, adopting the patient, open expression I had perfected over the years. In my line of work, it was often more about listening than asking. "He leaves the house at odd hours, comes back at all times of the night, and when I ask him where he's been, he just brushes me off," she continued, her fingers nervously twisting the wedding ring on her finger. "I thought maybe he was having an affair, but..." Her voice trailed off, and she seemed to shrink into herself, as if burdened by a weight too heavy to bear. "But you think it's something more," I finished for her, my instincts as a detective kicking in. There was a hesitancy in her manner that suggested she was afraid of what she might find out, yet desperate enough to seek help. Mrs. Whitaker nodded, her eyes meeting mine for the first time since she'd entered the room. There was a flicker of something in her gaze, fear, uncertainty, maybe even a hint of desperation. "It's not just his behavior," she said, her voice dropping to a hushed tone. "There have been incidents in Haden. Unpleasant ones. Vandalism, threats, and George seems to be somehow involved." I sat up straighter, My interest peaked. Haden, for all its quaint charm, was starting to reveal a darker underbelly, one that I hadn't expected but was all too familiar with from my past cases. "Do you have any proof of your husband's involvement?" I asked, reaching for my notepad. "Nothing concrete," she admitted, a look of frustration crossing her face. "Just rumors, whispers among the townsfolk. But you must understand, Mr. Thompson, George isn't a bad man. He's changed." I nodded, jotting down a few notes. Change in behavior, potential involvement in local disturbances, it was a start, but I needed more. "I'll look into it, Mrs. Whitaker," I assured her, offering a smile that I hoped was more reassuring than I felt. "But I need you to be prepared for what I might find." She nodded, a sense of resignation settling over her. "I just want to know the truth, Mr. Thompson. No matter what it is." As she left my office, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was stepping into something much larger than a simple case of a wayward husband. Haden, with its silent streets and watchful eyes, was hiding something, and I had just been given the key to start unlocking its secrets. I spent the rest of the day familiarizing myself with the layout of the town, its key locations, and the routines of its inhabitants. The more I observed, the more I felt the undercurrents of unease that seemed to permeate the air. It was as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the silence. That night, as I walked the quiet streets under the pale glow of the streetlights, I realized that Haden was much like a puzzle. And like all puzzles, it would take patience, intuition, and a keen eye to put the pieces together. But I was ready. After all, unraveling mysteries was what I did best. Chapter 2. The following morning, I started my investigation in earnest. Haden, with its colonial-era architecture and sprawling elm trees, might have been plucked from a postcard. But beneath its picturesque facade, I sensed the unease that Mrs. Whitaker had hinted at. As I walked through the town, I noticed the furtive glances of the locals, the hushed conversations that ceased as soon as I passed. It was as if the entire town was in on a secret, and I was the unwelcome outsider trying to pry it open. My first stop was the local diner, a hub of activity in the morning. I figured that if there were any rumors about George Whitaker or strange happenings in Haden, this would be the place to hear them. The diner was a cozy, somewhat cramped space, filled with the aroma of coffee and bacon. As I took a seat at the counter, I noticed a few heads turn, a mix of curiosity and caution in their eyes. I struck up a conversation with the waitress, a middle-aged woman with a warm smile and a no-nonsense attitude. Her name was Linda, and she had been a Haden resident all her life. As we talked, I casually brought up the topic of George Whitaker. "Oh, George," she said, pausing as she poured coffee into a mug. "Nice enough fellow. Keeps to himself mostly. But there have been some strange goings-on lately, and some folks are saying he's mixed up in it." "Strange goings-on?" I echoed, feigning ignorance. Linda leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "Vandalism at the church, threatening letters to the mayor, that sort of thing. It's not like Haden at all. We're a peaceful town, you know." I nodded, taking mental notes. This was in line with what Mrs. Whitaker had mentioned. But it was still circumstantial, nothing concrete. As I left the diner, I decided my next step would be to observe George Whitaker directly. I needed to see for myself what kind of man he was and whether there was any merit to the rumors surrounding him. I found George's residence on the outskirts of town, a modest two-story house with a well-tended garden. There was nothing particularly remarkable about it, but as I watched from a discreet distance, I noticed George leaving the house. He looked around nervously before locking the door and heading towards his car. His behavior was furtive, almost paranoid. I followed him at a safe distance, watching as he drove into the heart of town and parked near the town hall. He met with a few individuals, their conversations seeming heated and secretive. I couldn't catch their words, but their body language was telling. There was an urgency to their interactions, a sense of conspiratorial tension. After the meetings, George drove back home, and I took this as my cue to delve a bit deeper. I decided to pay a visit to the town hall next, to see if I could uncover anything about the letters to the mayor or any official concerns about the recent disturbances. At the town hall, I introduced myself as a private investigator working on a routine background check, a small white lie that often opened doors in my line of work. The staff were cooperative, and after some persuasion, I was able to view copies of the threatening letters. The letters were chilling in their content, filled with accusations and warnings against certain town policies. But what caught my attention was the handwriting. It was disguised, but there was a certain flair to it that seemed vaguely familiar. I left the town hall with more questions than answers. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, but the picture they were forming was one of complexity and danger. Haden was not just a town with a few isolated incidents of vandalism and threats. There was a deeper, more sinister plot at play, and I was determined to uncover it. As night fell over Haden, the shadows seemed to grow longer, the silence deeper. But within that silence, I could sense the whispers of a town holding its breath, waiting for the storm that was surely coming. Chapter 3. The next day dawned with a heavy, overcast sky, mirroring the growing unease I felt about the case. The more I delved into the secrets of Haden, the more entangled I became in its web of lies and deceit. It was clear now that George Whittaker was just a piece of a larger puzzle, a cog in a machine that was operating in the shadows of this small town. Determined to uncover more, I decided to visit the church that had been vandalized. It was an old building, its stone facade weathered by time, standing solemnly in a quiet part of town. The priest, Father O'Malley, was a gentle, elderly man with a kind face and a weary smile. He greeted me with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "I'm investigating some recent disturbances in the town," I explained, showing him my credentials. "I understand your church was vandalized?" Father O'Malley's expression darkened. "Yes, it was a most distressing incident. Someone broke in and defaced the altar. We've never had such sacrilege in Haden before." "Did you see who did it?" I asked. "No, but it stirred up quite a bit of talk," he replied, his eyes reflecting a deep sadness. "This town has always been a close-knit community, but now there's suspicion and fear." I thanked Father O'Malley for his time and left the church with a heavy heart. The vandalism at the church wasn't just an isolated act of defiance, it was a statement, a deliberate provocation designed to instill fear and disrupt the peace of the town. As I walked through the streets of Haden, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the town's gaze upon me. It was as if the town itself was aware of my investigation, and I was an unwelcome element in its carefully maintained facade. That evening, I decided to pay a visit to the local pub, a popular gathering spot for the townsfolk. Perhaps in the loosened tongues of the patrons, I might find a clue, a slip of the tongue that would give me the leverage I needed. The pub was a cozy, dimly lit establishment, filled with the murmur of conversations and the clink of glasses. I found a spot at the bar and ordered a drink, keeping my ears open to the chatter around me. It didn't take long for me to overhear a conversation about George Whittaker. Two men at a nearby table were discussing him in hushed tones, their words laced with suspicion and unease. "I'm telling you, there's something off about that man," said one, a burly fellow with a gruff voice. "He's been seen talking to some shady characters, and with all these strange happenings in Haden." His companion, a wiry man with sharp features, nodded in agreement. "And I heard his wife hired a private eye to look into it. Maybe she suspects something too." Their words confirmed my suspicion that George was deeply involved in whatever was happening in Haden. But there was still a missing piece, a connection I hadn't yet made. As I left the pub, the night had settled over Haden like a thick blanket, and a light drizzle began to fall. The streets were deserted, the only sound the soft patter of rain on cobblestones. I walked back to my office, lost in thought. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, but the image they were forming was still blurred, indistinct. I knew I was close to a breakthrough, close to uncovering the truth that lay hidden in the heart of Haden. But as I reached my office, I found something that sent a chill down my spine. Pinned to the door was a note, written in the same disguised hand as the letters to the mayor. It read simply, "Stop digging, or else." The threat was clear, and it told me one thing: I was on the right track. Someone in Haden was afraid of what I might find, and they were willing to go to great lengths to keep their secrets buried. But I was not deterred. If anything, the threat only strengthened my resolve. I would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Haden's shadows would not keep its secrets from me. Chapter 4. The note pinned to my door was a warning, a stark reminder that my investigation had stirred the waters of a once stagnant pond. I took it down, examining the handwriting closely under the lamplight of my office. The script was deliberately obscured, but the aggression behind the words was palpable. Whoever wrote this was deeply invested in keeping Haden's secrets buried. It was a threat, but also a sign that I was closing in on the truth. Sleep was elusive that night. My mind raced with possibilities, theories weaving in and out of the shadows that played across the ceiling of my small apartment above the office. The pattern of the rain against the window seemed to echo the rhythm of my thoughts, constant, unending, a persistent search for clarity. The next morning, I was back on the streets of Haden, a renewed sense of purpose guiding my steps. The town seemed different in the daylight, the shadows of the night receding into the corners and crevices of the buildings. But the unease remained, a palpable tension in the air that even the morning sun couldn't dispel. My first stop was the local library. If there were any records or histories that could shed light on recent events or George Whitaker's past, I would find them there. The librarian, a stoic woman named Mrs. Hargrove, watched me with a mix of curiosity and suspicion as I combed through old newspapers and town records. Haden's history was rich, filled with tales of settlers, skirmishes, and survival, but nothing that hinted at the current unrest. Frustrated but not deterred, I decided to revisit the Whitaker residence. Perhaps a second, more thorough look might reveal something I had missed. As I approached the house, I noticed something odd: the front door was ajar. Cautiously, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The house was silent, the air stale and heavy. A sense of foreboding washed over me as I moved through the living room, noting the scattered papers and overturned furniture. Something violent had happened here. I made my way to the study, where I found the most disturbing scene yet. Papers were strewn everywhere, drawers emptied, and in the center of the chaos was George Whitaker, slumped over his desk, a pool of blood darkening the wood beneath him. My heart raced as I checked for a pulse, but it was clear that I was too late. George Whitaker was dead, and his murder was a stark escalation in the events plaguing Haden. This was no longer just a case of secret meetings and vague threats, it was now a homicide investigation, with high stakes and unknown dangers. I called the local police, who arrived quickly and took over the scene. I explained my involvement, omitting the threatening note but sharing my observations of George's recent behavior. The police were skeptical of my role, but I could tell they were out of their depth. Haden wasn't equipped for murder investigations. As the police worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that George's death was a message, a warning to those who dared to uncover the secrets buried deep within the town. But who would go to such lengths to protect these secrets? And why? I returned to my office, my mind a whirlwind of questions and theories. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but the picture they formed was dark and troubling. Haden, with its picturesque streets and tight-knit community, was a facade, a mask that hid a much more sinister reality. I pored over my notes, connecting dots, drawing lines between the vandalism, the threatening letters, and now, George Whitaker's murder. There was a pattern, a purpose behind these events, and I was determined to uncover it. As night fell over Haden once again, I knew that the key to solving this mystery lay within the town's history, its people, and the secrets they guarded so fiercely. I would need to tread carefully, for the shadows of Haden were deep and dangerous, and someone was watching, waiting for me to make my next move. Chapter 5. The death of George Whittaker had sent ripples through Haden, unsettling the quiet facade of the town. As I sat in my office, the gravity of the situation weighing heavily on me, I knew I had to tread carefully. George's death wasn't just a tragic end, it was a stark message to anyone who dared to dig too deep into Haden's secrets. But backing down wasn't in my nature. If anything, the stakes were now higher, and the truth even more crucial. I spent the night poring over everything I had gathered: notes, interviews, the cryptic letter pinned to my door. Everything pointed towards a deeply rooted conspiracy, one that was entangled with the town's history. It was clear that whatever was happening in Haden wasn't new, it was the resurgence of something old, something that had been simmering under the surface for years, if not decades. The next morning, with a fresh perspective and a new determination, I decided to visit the town's historical society. If the answers were rooted in Haden's past, then that was where I would start. The historical society was housed in a quaint, ivy-covered building at the edge of town. Inside, I was greeted by an elderly volunteer, Mr. Harold Jenkins, whose knowledge of Haden's history was as vast as the archives he tended to. I explained my interest in the town's past, particularly any events or periods of unrest. Harold listened intently, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully as I spoke. "You might be interested in the old town records then," he suggested, leading me to a dusty section of the archives. There was a period, back in the late 1800s, when Haden faced a series of challenges. Disputes over land, mysterious disappearances, tensions within the community. As I delved into the old records, a picture began to emerge. Haden, during that tumultuous period, was a town divided. There were families who held power and influence, and those who were marginalized, their voices silenced. It was a history of conflict, secrets, and betrayals, elements that seemed to be repeating themselves in the present day. One name recurred in several documents: Whittaker. It appeared that George's ancestors were integral to Haden's history, involved in key events that had shaped the town. This connection couldn't be a coincidence. George's recent activities, his murder, were somehow tied to his family's past. Armed with this new information, I returned to my investigation with a renewed vigor. The pieces were starting to fit together, forming a picture of a town haunted by its past, its present just a reflection of old wounds and hidden grudges. As I walked back to my office, I felt eyes on me. Someone was watching, tracking my movements. The threat on my door was no idle warning, I was being observed, my investigation monitored. I quickened my pace, aware of the delicate position I was in. Back at my office, I received an unexpected visitor. It was Mrs. Whittaker, Eleanor. She looked distraught, her eyes red-rimmed and her hands trembling. "Mr. Thompson, I heard about George," she stammered, her voice breaking. "They say he was murdered." I nodded solemnly, ushering her into a chair. "There's something I didn't tell you before," she continued, her voice barely a whisper. "It's about George's family, their history in Haden. There are things, dark things, that have been kept hidden. I think it's why George was killed." Her revelation confirmed my suspicions. The events in Haden were not random acts of violence or disruptions. They were part of a legacy, a historical cycle of power and revenge. Eleanor's story opened a new chapter in my investigation, one that delved deep into the heart of Haden's past. As I listened to her, I realized that the key to solving the mystery lay in understanding the town's history, the long-buried secrets that had resurfaced with deadly consequences. Haden, with its picturesque streets and close-knit community, was a town haunted by its past. And it was up to me to bring those ghosts into the light. Chapter 6. Eleanor's revelations were like opening a Pandora's box of Haden's history. The Whittaker family, it seemed, had been at the center of a long-standing feud with another influential family in Haden, the Harrisons. This feud, rooted in a land dispute dating back generations, had evolved into a complex web of secrets and lies that had shaped the town's history. The feud was never resolved, Eleanor explained, her voice trembling. It just went underground, simmering beneath the surface. George discovered something recently, something that could have exposed it all. But before he could do anything, he was killed. I listened intently, scribbling down notes. The puzzle pieces were slowly fitting together, but there were still gaps. The motive for George's murder was becoming clearer, but the identity of the perpetrator remained elusive. I needed to speak to the Harrisons. If the feud was the key to understanding George's murder, then they would have answers. I thanked Eleanor and promised her that I would do everything in my power to bring George's killer to justice. As I headed towards the Harrison estate, I couldn't help but feel the weight of Haden's history pressing down on me. The town, with its charming facades and friendly locals, was a mask hiding decades of animosity and conflict. The Harrison estate, a grand old mansion on the outskirts of Haden, stood as a testament to the family's wealth and influence. I was greeted at the door by Jonathan Harrison, the patriarch of the family. He was a tall, imposing figure, with a stern face that seemed etched from years of holding power. I explained my reason for visiting, and to my surprise, he welcomed me in. Inside, the mansion was a stark contrast to the humble surroundings of Haden. It was opulent, filled with antiques and portraits of Harrisons dating back centuries. Jonathan led me to his study, a room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large mahogany desk. "George Whitaker's death is a tragedy," he began, his voice measured. "But I assure you, a family's feud has long been buried." I wasn't convinced. The documents I had seen, Eleanor's story, they all pointed to something more. I pressed him, asking about the land dispute, the tension between the families. Jonathan sighed, a flicker of emotion crossing his otherwise stoic face. "Yes, there was a dispute, but that was a long time ago. We have lived in peace for generations." As we talked, I sensed that Jonathan was holding back, his answers too rehearsed, too polished. There was something he wasn't telling me, a piece of the puzzle that he was keeping hidden. As I left the Harrison estate, my mind was racing. The connection between the Whitakers and Harrisons was undeniable, but the exact nature of their feud and how it related to George's murder was still unclear. I needed more evidence, more information to piece it all together. I decided to pay a visit to the local library, hoping to find more historical records that might shed light on the Whitaker-Harrison feud. As I sifted through old newspapers and archives, a headline from a paper dated over a century ago caught my eye: "Disastrous fire at Whitaker Mill, suspected arson." The article detailed a fire that had destroyed a mill owned by the Whitakers, a pivotal event in the town's history that had escalated the feud with the Harrisons. The fire was suspected to be an act of arson, but no one was ever charged. It was a turning point, a moment that had set the course for generations of hostility and secrecy. As I delved deeper into the archives, the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. The feud, the fire, the secrets, they were all interconnected, part of a tapestry of history that had culminated in George Whitaker's murder. Haden was a town haunted by its past, and now, it was up to me to uncover the truth and bring closure to a conflict that had spanned generations. Chapter 7. The old newspaper clippings and documents painted a picture of a town divided by a bitter feud, one that had endured through the years, manifesting in various forms but never truly resolved. The fire at the Whitaker Mill was a significant event, a catalyst that had hardened the divide. I wondered if the recent events in Haden, including George's murder, were a continuation of this old conflict. Leaving the library, I felt a mix of anticipation and apprehension. Unraveling a town's deeply held secrets was like walking through a minefield, especially when those secrets involved powerful families like the Whitakers and Harrisons. But I was determined to see it through, to unearth the truth that had been buried for too long. As I walked through the town, I couldn't help but see Haden in a different light. The charming streets and friendly faces now seemed like a facade, masking the undercurrents of resentment and bitterness that ran deep. I realized that to solve George Whitaker's murder, I had to understand not just the facts of the case, but the emotions and motivations that had driven the people involved. I decided my next step was to revisit the scene of George's murder. Sometimes, returning to the crime scene could reveal overlooked clues or spark new insights. As I approached the Whitaker residence, I noticed something odd. A light was on in the study where I had found George's body. Cautiously, I entered the house. The study was in disarray, much as I had left it, but on the desk was a small, leather-bound book that I hadn't noticed before. Picking it up, I realized it was a journal, George Whitaker's journal. The entries were sporadic, but as I flipped through the pages, George's state of mind in the weeks before his death became evident. He was worried, paranoid. He wrote of discovering a shocking truth about his family's past and its connection to the Harrisons. He hinted at a secret that could destroy both families, a revelation that he feared would bring dire consequences. As I read, the door to the study creaked open. I looked up to find Eleanor Whitaker standing there, a mix of surprise and fear on her face. "I didn't expect to find anyone here," she said, her voice trembling. "I found George's journal," I replied, holding it up. It seems he uncovered something significant about the past, something he feared. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. George was obsessed with our family's history towards the end. He said he had found something that would change everything, but he wouldn't tell me what it was. I didn't realize how serious it was until it was too late. Her admission was a confirmation of my suspicions. The feud between the Whitakers and Harrisons was more than just a historical rivalry, it was a living, breathing entity that had claimed George's life. I needed to confront the Harrisons again, armed with this new information. As I left the Whitaker residence, I felt a sense of urgency. The truth was close, I could feel it. But so was the danger. The shadows of Haden were closing in, and I knew that revealing the town's secrets would not come without a cost. As night fell over Haden, the town seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the revelations that were about to unfold. And I, caught in the middle of a century-old conflict, was ready to bring the truth to light. Chapter 8. With George Whitaker's journal in hand, I felt like I was holding a key piece of the puzzle. The entries were cryptic, but the underlying message was clear. George had stumbled upon a secret so profound that it threatened to upheave the delicate balance of power in Haden. The question now was, what was this secret, and how did it lead to his death? The following day, I arranged a meeting with Jonathan Harrison. This time, I approached the Grand Harrison estate with a new sense of determination. The sprawling mansion, with its manicured lawns and imposing facade, seemed to symbolize the power and influence the family wielded over Haden. Jonathan Harrison greeted me in his study, the same room where we had first met. His demeanor was calm, but there was a tension in his posture, a readiness for confrontation. "I've discovered something," I began, placing George's journal on the desk between us. "It appears that George Whitaker found out something significant about our family's past. Something that someone was willing to kill for." Jonathan's eyes flicked to the journal, then back to me. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but there was a slight falter in his voice. "George was afraid," I pressed on. "He wrote about a revelation, something that could destroy both the Whitakers and the Harrisons. I believe it's connected to the old feud, to the fire at the Whitaker mill." For a moment, Jonathan was silent, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he let out a sigh, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "The feud between our families has always been more than just a land dispute," he said, his voice weary. "It was about power, control over Haden. The fire at the Whitaker mill. It wasn't an accident. It was arson, orchestrated by my ancestors to weaken the Whitakers." I listened, stunned. This confession was more than I had hoped for. It was a motive, a thread that connected the past to the present. But why would this lead to George's murder? I asked. Because George found proof, Jonathan replied. Proof that would have exposed my family's actions, tarnished our name. It seems someone in my family went to great lengths to keep that from happening. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The feud, the fire, the secrets, they had all culminated in a desperate act to protect a legacy. George Whitaker's murder was the result of a century-old vendetta, a final, tragic chapter in a long history of conflict. I left the Harrison estate with a heavy heart. The truth was out, but it was a truth that came with a cost. Haden, for all its charm and beauty, was a town scarred by its past, its present shaped by the sins of its forebears. In the days that followed, the revelations about the Whitaker-Harrison feud became public. The town was rocked by the news, its residents forced to confront the dark history that had been hidden for so long. The police, with the evidence I provided, were able to make an arrest, a member of the Harrison family, driven by a misguided sense of duty to protect their name. As for me, my work in Haden was done. I had uncovered the truth, brought closure to a long-standing conflict. But the experience had left its mark on me. Haden, with its whispering trees and watchful eyes, would always be a reminder of the shadows that lurk beneath the surface of even the most idyllic towns. I packed up my office, ready to move on to the next case, the next mystery. But as I left Haden, I couldn't help but look back one last time. The town, now exposed and vulnerable, seemed different, as if a veil had been lifted. And in that moment, I understood the true nature of my work. It wasn't just about solving mysteries or uncovering secrets. It was about bringing light to the shadows, about revealing the truth that lies hidden in the hearts of places like Haden. Aftermath, the echoes of Haden. As I drove away from Haden, the town fading in my rearview mirror, I couldn't shake off the feeling of introspection that had enveloped me. The case in Haden was more than just a puzzle solved, it was a journey into the depths of human nature and the haunting legacy of history. In the weeks that followed, Haden grappled with its newfound reality. The arrest of a prominent Harrison family member for George Whitaker's murder had sent shockwaves through the community. It was a sobering reminder of how the sins of the past can cast long shadows over the present. The Whitaker-Harrison feud, once the subject of hushed whispers and rumor, was now laid bare for all to see. Families in Haden, who had lived for generations under the weight of this unspoken history, began to view each other and their town in a new light. There was a sense of catharsis, a collective unburdening of a secret too long kept. For the Whitakers and Harrisons, the revelation brought a complex mix of emotions. There was grief, certainly, for the loss of George and the violent history that had claimed his life. But there was also a glimmer of hope, a chance for reconciliation and a new beginning. The two families, once locked in an endless cycle of rivalry and resentment, now faced the daunting task of forging a new relationship, built on understanding and acknowledgement of the past. As for the town of Haden, the aftermath of the case brought about a period of reflection and soul-searching. The idyllic facade of the town had been irrevocably altered. Residents found themselves re-evaluating their community, questioning the narratives they had long held about their history and their neighbors. There was an effort to come to terms with the past, to understand it and learn from it, so that the mistakes of yesteryear would not be repeated. For me, the case left a lasting impact. As a detective, I had seen my share of dark secrets and hidden truths. But Haden was different. It was a reminder that every town, no matter how picturesque or tranquil, has its own shadows. It underscored the importance of looking beyond the surface, of seeking the truth that lies beneath. As I continued my journey, taking on new cases in new places, the lessons of Haden stayed with me. The pursuit of truth was not just a professional endeavor, it was a moral one. In bringing to light the hidden secrets of places like Haden, I wasn't just solving mysteries, I was helping to heal the wounds of the past. And so, as the road stretched out before me, I carried with me the memories of Haden, a town that, like so many others, was a tapestry of beauty and tragedy, secrets and revelations, a place where the